Welcome to the Depth Dialogues podcast.
where we explore how depth psychology is applied to tackle contemporary social issues.
I'm Kirk Schneider.
And I'm Tyler Gamlin. Okay, welcome back, everyone. On today's episode of Depth Dialogues, we're honored to host Rhonda Magee, a leading voice at the intersection of mindfulness, social justice, and transformative education. As a law professor at the University of San Francisco, Rhonda has dedicated more than 20 years to integrating mindfulness into legal education, social change, and leadership. She's the author of The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness, a groundbreaking work that embodies the intersection of depth psychology, contemplative practice, and social transformation. Rhonda's teaching and writing illuminate the ways mindfulness can foster self-awareness, deepen empathy, and create the conditions for meaningful change. Her emphasis on embodied awareness and presence-based leadership resonates deeply with the mission of this podcast, engaging with the inner dimensions of human experience to address the challenges of our shared world. Through her work as a teacher, facilitator, and thought leader, Rhonda brings a profound understanding of how inner work can catalyze outer change. Her insights into mindful communication, social identity-based bias, and the integration of soulfulness into professional and personal life make her an invaluable voice for this dialogue. It's an honor to welcome Professor Rhonda Magee to the Depth Dialogues podcast. Thank you for joining us, Rhonda.
My dear, thank you. Really honored to be with you.
Rhonda, so appreciative of reconnecting with you after all these years.
Me too.
Coming full circle to today and our times, and of course the major challenges of our times.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to begin by asking you if you could elaborate some on what really sparked you to move in this direction of socially conscious law, bringing mindfulness to the questions of social justice and of lifting all of us as human beings in this difficult world.
Oh, well, I thank you so much for this question and for the broader conversation that your work is inspiring right now. It's so important. So thank you to you, Kurt, and to Tyler. I think really, as I really am taking in your question, I often think that with great projects, like with the great projects that our lives somehow call forth, there are some ways that we can sort of story how we got there, but then there are aspects of it that we can't fully explain. I do think that I was fortunate to grow up in the southern part of the United States during the period associated with the kind of post-civil rights movement. I was born in 1967. I often say the last year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life on the planet. It was the year in which I arrived. And so it was a period of a lot of change, different than, but not unlike now. And, being rooted in that southern part of the United States gave me a particular, sort of place within which to have a kind of a felt sense of, the kinds of challenges and opportunities that our social worlds present. Because being born in this body, and for those who are just listening, I'll just say, I'm African American heritage, brown body, cisgender, female, and born in this kind of sort of packaging. And in the southern part of the United States, it was obvious to me that there were a lot of deep trainings and messages about who I might be, who others who look like me might become. And at the same time, I do think I was fortunate in two non-obvious ways. One, that I sort of had a sense from a very, very early age. Like I remember being like in like a playpen, right? So I don't know how old that was, but I was, couldn't really speak yet. But I just had a sense that there was more to being alive and to what it meant, to be alive than was obvious, than was articulable, right? So I had this. I think I was fortunate to sort of have a kind of a view that was broader than what was being taught to me, from a very early age. And maybe related, but I think somehow separate, intersecting with that, was the fact that my grandmother had been called into the ministry. So, also as a young girl, and my family, my parents were separating, and I was spending a lot of time with my grandmother. And I would see her as an embodiment of a kind of a way of being in the world, grounded in commitments to somehow centering oneself and being disciplined about how to engage the day, right? So she'd get up before dawn, and for her it was a prayerful kind of contemplative prayer practice, but she was drawn to Christianity, steeped in Christianity, but just seeing how she seemed to kind of be dedicated to cultivating a way of meeting the challenges that she faced as an elder, Black woman in the late 1960s, right? Where she had never had very much in the way of the kind of education that I ultimately was privileged to receive. She had only been able to go to school through elementary school, had to then work in the fields during day work, very similar to what sharecroppers and before that enslaved women would have done, right? So she was still on a certain level doing that kind of work, but yet she had a sense and a set of practices that helped ground her in a broader view of her life. So I think, those background, that background setting, that immersion in that particular place and time kind of stayed with me as I went into conventional education spaces, actually participated in the kind of what we call the desegregation movement, if you will, the post-civil rights movement. In other words, I was a child being bused to desegregate schools in Virginia in the era after their massive resistance, right? There was a period in Virginia where the schools literally shut down, public schools shut down in many regions after the Brown versus Board decision came through mandating integration, right? There was resistance to that. So by the time I came along, we'd passed that. We were actually seeking to fulfill the promise of Brown versus Board for a period of time there. Again, that time came and went. But I grew up during that period. And so I went to, integrated schools, right, where there were whites and Blacks who had not always been in those spaces together. But for my entire, first grade through the rest of my education, experience what it's like to be in those settings. And so I think it's all of those dynamics that have fueled the sense of purposefulness around what it means to have an opportunity to have to be educated, to participate in a changing multicultural democracy. It was like I felt like my life had put me in a position to see a depth to the opportunities, to go to school and to get my degrees. And so, I've always touched into the depth of the meaningfulness of these opportunities that are not always present, that come and go, that I have been fortunate to experience. And so I've always taken that into my work as a lawyer, then law professor, and then ultimately it helped fuel my interest in the inner work dimension of social change.
Yes, yes. Really appreciate your reflective, uh, in-depth answer and spirit that comes through. Um, so it sounds like what might be called a depth dimension, or maybe even a kind of sacred energy, a sacred self behind the masks and the conventional selves that we often present in the world, became and has become extremely important to what you're offering our world right now. And in particular, uh, the the divisiveness, the polarization that we're experiencing culturally, politically. Can you, I wonder if you can say more. I know it's hard to describe this verbally because it is such a pre-verbal and embodied dimension. But can you say more about why you think this depth dimension is so important to our world right now
Mm.
in terms of the people that you're meeting and engaging with? And
Yeah.
who are those people also?
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, so at this moment, I've just transitioned out of my full-time role as a law professor at the University of San Francisco, and I'm professor emeritus now, right? So I
Mm.
can continue to work with law students there, and I do in some ways. So I've, for example, met with and created spaces for dialogue during this period of political transition. Post-election, we gathered
Mhm.
and I convened a circle for reflection around what are the implications of this and how are we feeling about all of this. So that kind of work I will continue to do in with law students in places of higher education. I'm often called in to sort of catalyze ways of thinking about being together in our university spaces. So I'll be going to, for example, Washington State University next week to offer a keynote presentation on the theme of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy, but one that will help catalyze this effort to bring the inner dimension into teaching and learning at Washington State University. So the kind of work that I do these days is, building on the sort of long history I have in higher education,
Mhm.
but I also convene spaces for just meditating, whatever our background. I feel at this time in my life, I'm often inspired to, I can, to dissolve the walls
Mhm.
that tend to separate us. And as much as I love higher education, I have felt often that it tends to, kind of isolate us or can separate us into our disciplines
Mhm.
and and our people with the alphabet behind their names. And so kind of reconnecting or finding ways to bridge across these lines of real and perceived difference is just a very, very, feels very essential to
Mm.
me, right?
Am I right to
Yeah, it
reflect
has,
back? I'm
yes.
sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, of course, that has implications for the politics or the working with the energy and the sort of social divisiveness
Mhm.
that is often present in our world right now. Yeah, so to me it feels like there's a call. Maybe post
Mhm.
COVID,
Mhm.
maybe this time in my life, having taught law for more than 25 years, it just has felt to me very, very important not to let the traditional boundaries of how we teach and learn get in the way of teaching and learning right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way I relate to that is
Mm.
I'm very much with you about the need, the imperative for inner work right now and the focus more on inner lives. We've had so much focus in our culture in particular on the external, right? The measurable, the behavioral, how we perform,
Yeah.
our images, etc. But how much do we pay attention to our inner lives? And so it feels like you relate to the notion I often invoke. Maybe people are tired of it, but I think it's so relevant to today. Uh, that if we don't get to work with the inner lives, and especially our fears that come up
Yeah.
in the inner lives, that we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Totally relate to that.
Mhm.
Totally. And and just to amplify a bit more what you're saying, 100%, at least it's my experience, again, rooted here in the United States, living on the West Coast now, but having been raised in the southern part of the US on the East Coast. Um, it does feel like our culture, is running certain kinds of ways of being that reinforce the kind of hyper externality and hyper individualism, right? But so much focus on what is the outward seeming and outward presenting,
Mhm.
and not enough at all um, focus on interiority or on, sort of the kind of interconnection between the sense that we have of ourselves as separate selves with, kind of our own psyche and our own work to do and all of that, which is real and important in a certain sense, but not the whole story, at least in my view. We tend to overstate our separateness.
Mhm.
And in a similar way, I think or another dimension that I think we're working with is we overstate the present, if you will, or the now. We are or some notion of something like a short-term future with, I think, too little attention given to what we call the past, the relevance of history for
Mhm.
today. So it's all of those. It's like this hyper kind of presentism, if I may use that word to kind of describe what I'm pointing to here, individualism, uh, and yeah, this is sort of really, I think, failure to really see our both communal and our interconnected nature in all things
Mhm.
that draws me to wanting to explore this depthful inner work as kind of essential, it seems to me, for helping us navigate these times.
Maybe failure to see each other, to really see. That's
Yeah, exactly.
Tyler, you have.
Yeah. So many things coming up for me here. And one thing that comes to mind too is this underemphasis of the impact that we can have in our professional life, where the work that we do can't bleed into that space. That's something that I've seen, at least, where that's usually where we can have the biggest impact too. So there's
Yeah.
this missed opportunity to say, I'm going to advocate for change in my profession, in how I relate to others. And when Kirk told me about the work that you do, I was so drawn to that. And it just, in terms of how different that is, at least in my experience, seeing that in the law profession, being really grounded in that kind of social justice approach and bringing mindfulness into it. Maybe I'm just not aware of other people doing that, but it at the same time, it really connected with what our focus is here with the core of depth healers, which I think lends to why we invited you to be here. But I'm just so struck by how you apply that in your work and how that's embodied. And one thing that you shared early on about your experience that you had the opportunity, I forget what the exact wording was, but it was something about having the opportunity to have these experiences, which a lot of people, as we know, would would not see that the same way. And there was, maybe moments of adversity that you're able to look at and say, well, there was growth here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so there's two pieces that I'm thinking of in response to your your observations, my dear Tyler. The piece that's about changing how we are in these professions, right? Which has really been a big part of what I've been drawn to do. And a part that's not easy, right? I'll just say that, like, the places and spaces where we get certified as competent to do something in the world that we didn't create, but that is an ongoing project with a lot of, let's say, embeddedness and investedness, right? I mean, it's like, the world that we're trying to kind of, in some ways, change or transform has its own very different commitments, right? To maintain and to reinforce itself, right? Seems to be what the dominant parent, what dominance does, right? How it got to be is the dominant paradigm.
Yeah.
It's not really like trying to invite change all the time, right? So it's not easy, I think, to seek to bring an inner dimension to education, to how we do any, sort of profession that, again, we sort of, we're born into a world which has created these professions, and they've done what they do in ways that are deemed successful for a reason, right? So I guess all I'm saying is, like, yes, I certainly keep saying yes to this, what I see as a kind of invitation presented by whatever we're called to do, to not only, become a kind of a good mimic of what is presented as the dominant, way to be in those roles, but to really allow whatever it is that draws us to that place, those opportunities, to kind of be infused with what I use this phrase, original medicine, or our original view, or whatever it is that the universe is seeking to enact through our unique embodiment. I just believe that there's no accidents.
Yeah.
We are these, like, radically sort of unique, and at the same time, poignantly similar. That you're like, we have 100% unique vistas and viewpoints because of our background, right? And our heritage. No two of us have walked the same exact steps,
yeah,
no matter how similar we seem outwardly.
Yeah.
We're all different.
Yeah.
And yet we know what it's like to have our hearts broken. We know what it's like to be depressed, to have, to grieve, to want the better things, to want to be loved, right? So it's like, so I do think that there's something important about the fact that we have these differentiated experiences and views that is sort of almost embedded in that as some sort of a unique call. And so that whatever we get called to do in the world, to make a living in this hyper-capitalist time that we're in, to me, it seems like, there is an underlying invitation to, like a trickster type of, like, energy of, like, we don't know why. There's a mystical piece of, but, like, if we have the courage, if our mission, should we choose to accept it, try to meld our originality, our whatever that is, trust that there's something good in that, but meld that with the world that we inhabit, the roles we inhabit, and try and bring forth some healing medicine. It just seems to me that that's what we're kind of called to do. And so when I think about, and then the other piece I wanted to just say a bit about your observation, that when I talk about my own experiences, and use some language that suggests I see opportunity in all of it, and some kind of gift in all of it, I know that that's not the common way we think of things. In the traditional psychological sense, I was a child that grew up in, like, what is now conventionally, I think we're still in this, maybe some new paradigm, that I don't know, but like the multiple ACEs, like the multiple adverse childhood experiences, traumas, right? I was one, I was that child, right? Born into a home where there were, some of the kinds of things that I've already pointed to, right? Parents were divorcing. It's the civil rights era, a Black heritage child, right? So there's a broader, racism and sexism that are impacting my world and my experiences for sure. So there were within the home dynamics, some of which I've already pointed to, others I'll add, kind of alcoholism and abuse and this and that, domestic violence. And then so the internal and then the external social issues that were all impacting on me. And there was a lot of pain that came from that, especially during my childhood. It was not easy to get from there to here.
How did you emerge, Rhonda? Say a little more about what helped you to emerge.
It's a good question. I do think so part of it, I think, again, is sort of almost cosmic mission, in the sense that, like, okay, some part of it I can't take credit for. And, there were people that there were always, I think, if a person like me doesn't arrive here without there having been at least some other human beings that helped. And I'm thinking of, it sounds cliche, but like teachers, public school teachers.
We know that that's a big factor.
Yeah. It really was, who at different points along the way, K through 12, helped me see myself, helped me see what they saw, like in terms of potential and ability. And so kept kind of shielding me from some of the ways that public schools maybe don't do that enough for every child. And kept sort of funneling me here and there toward opportunities. Because, as I've alluded to, I was growing up in a household where there were I had my parents were there, my mother and father, and then my mother and stepfather. My father and stepfather, both alcoholics, both frankly abusive. My mother, well, the kind of woman who meets the same kind of man, right? So let's just say my parents did the best they could, but they certainly weren't in a position to help me heal these traumas. So notwithstanding the fact that I didn't have within my household that kind of support between whatever was in me to seize every opportunity I was a reader, right? So that helped me envision a world differently. I loved school, and I saw school as a safer place. I saw libraries as safer places. So whatever that energy was then met with enough people who would affirm that it kind of got me through. And, so I fully see myself as, part of, I will say I've been reading Martin Luther King Jr. a lot, of course, this time of year, and the presentations I'm giving on the theme of his life and legacy, and other inspirational figures has been a part of my process over the last half year. Having given myself a little bit more time in this transition from full-time teaching, I've just been reading more of the inspirational teachers of social justice and spiritual social justice. Like I'm looking for those kinds of teachers and to read. And so it's people like Pauli Murray, whose name not everyone knows, but she was just this absolutely pivotal figure for actually the world that we have inherited in terms of civil rights for all, that includes women's and LGBTQIA plus, right? Queer folks, like the possibilities that we've experienced in the post-civil rights era were largely envisioned. And this is a lot to say, but they were the brainchild of this woman, Pauli Murray, who many people don't know, because she was like the only woman in her law school class at Howard University in the 1930s. and a Black woman at that, who envisioned desegregation and how to get there, who envisioned and was a co-founder of the National Organization for Women. And she later became an Episcopal priest, one of the first women, certainly the first Black woman Episcopal priest, later a saint in the Episcopal Church. Again, she's like literally was elevated to sainthood in that church. Many people don't know her, but if you read her, she clearly speaks to how she saw herself. She heard this in King's teaching. She would hear it in Gandhi, on and on and on. This sense that to do social work is always to do spiritual work. Like if you're trying to change the world, it's spiritual in some way. Whether you think of it as secular or religious, know that you're part of this cosmic community in that sense too, of folks who have been trying to do this work and who will try to do it once we are gone. Mm-hmm. So there's some way that I feel that the helpers that I met, and they, you know, were like, they were first grade teachers and 10th grade teachers. They did not necessarily see themselves, because I don't think everybody sees things this way, even if they're part of it. Right. But I see my first grade teacher, my 10th grade, you know, Mrs. Smith, you know, Mrs. Morris, right? By the way, who were white women who were part of, like, who had this taken the opportunity to teach in these early integrated spaces, right? Yeah. And, you know, in those roles, did that slightly cliched thing, at least in my life, of kind of helping me find the next step. So, yeah, I think that we are, you know, while we have our conventional roles and resumes and jobs and all of that, there's another dimension in a way to what it is that we're doing. And Pauli Murray spoke of there being, King and others resonating with this idea that when you do social change work, you are part of a kind of a cosmic network of change agents. You don't necessarily know it, but you're not alone. And so I do think of my experience as benefiting from, you know, spirits, helpers, known and unknown. And that all helped me. They all helped me somehow to kind of move in the direction of the light, you know, to kind of move in the direction of healing. It took a long journey. You know, I had to find a psychologist when I was in my own 30s, right? Kind of, I had a period where I was kind of going through a really dark night phase where I had got my law degree. I had got my job at the University of San Francisco. I had gotten tenure. And then I was having this feeling of like, is this all there is? Because these were all the traditional successful things, but I was not feeling happy. My personal life was not going particularly well. I got married. I was going through a divorce. So I was going through a period where I was questioning all these conventional methods. So this is just to say that now I can look back and see that it took a while for me to get this clear about all of these things and have a very clear sense of like, these are gifts, you know? So in my early to mid 30s, when I was going through that dark night period, I will add another helper that I found, like, who's a spiritually trained therapist, right? Who, you know, the University, Naropa University, many listeners be familiar with Naropa as a place where you can go to be trained to bring a kind of spiritual dimension into, for example, psychology. So she was one of those graduates who came to the Bay Area, and I met her at a particular time. And I say that because not every psychologist that I met was particularly helpful. But this particular psychologist, I think, was part of it. The relationship we built over time, there was enough resonance and enough affirmation and just heartful, caring friendship that we developed together, that I definitely think my experiencing that period of counseling was also maybe the last major bit of healing work that I really needed. And now, that particular counselor, after some years and time, we become friends.
Mm-hmm.
And now, she would be kind of embarrassed to hear me say all of these things about her. But she's sort of like, no, now you're the healer. You need to go out and talk. But I mean, but really, I wouldn't be here without that too.
With Rhonda, thank you so much for sharing that, especially this last bit about your personal experience, kind of moving out of that time in your 30s.
Mm.
One of the things that came to mind for me while you were sharing was a question about common factors that you've found in the research you've done and your experience with these people throughout your life. What are things, irrespective of whether they're a first grade teacher or a counselor, what are some of the things that you've found that are in common across those folks?
Mm. Well, I thank you for this question. It's such an insightful and beautiful one. And I think the answer is something I've alluded to a little bit, that unconventional quality of love.
Yeah.
I do think that
Love in action.
Yeah.
Yes, right? Whether first grade teacher,
Yeah.
10th grade teacher, counselor, law professor, activist.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about, I feel like I've experienced that quality in those people. Yeah, I'm pausing just to really take this question in a little bit more. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for asking it. And I'm pausing too, because this is where often this work gets very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that on every level. I feel like I'm touching into this.
I think we lost her for a second there.
Sort of soft. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So just to say, I feel a certain kind of vulnerability in the space now, right? My heart feels a little softer as I reflect on that, having experienced what to me feels like that quality of love, coming through teachers and, activists, colleagues, what I think of as like spiritual mentors, people I never met, but whose work and scholarship and writings I'm inspired by. So I feel like there's that vulnerability that's coming up in my heart right now, which is why I'm pausing a little bit. But also, I think it's where this change work is often vulnerable. And what I'm trying to say here is, we don't have in our culture very much, I think, in the way of support for speaking about love. Mm-hmm. As this, in this way, like this quality of love that is not about a hallmark representation of a kind of syrupy, right? I mean, it is. So I also think we are dealing with kind of a poverty of language, right? In a way, we had another word.
Yeah.
Because what I'm talking about is like what I think is the force that turns everything, that like powers everything. And so we'll call it love in action. Mm-hmm. But I do think that is what links all of the types of folks that I'm talking about, and this cosmic intergenerational ancestors to the future, right? Mm-hmm. Network of beings and spirits, where I think manifestations of the loving energy that our lives came to manifest, right? Came to represent in the world. And it's hard to be that. It's hard to be that, whatever our social embodiment, frankly, but I think it's especially hard for male body folk. So I'm privileged, I feel, to be in a conversation with you two about this. I'm curious what's coming up for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, that L word as a touchstone for how we are in the world.
Mm.
Yeah, there's not, in fact, especially right now, as we prepare for a change in public administrations, a new, era with our the new presidency about to be to commence here in 2025. The sociologist in me is aware that in different eras, the social context kind of more or less avails itself or opens up pathways for us to be in different kinds of conversations. And we're in a time socially where it's going to be even harder to be vulnerable in public, to speak about love in public, right? Because there's an energy and power, and there are, some networks that are arraying around that, and leadership is contagious, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of almost narcissistic, fear-based resistance to all calls to compassion and vulnerability, right? That's going to be more of a feature in the coming, at least short term. The sociologist in me is aware that, again, these social dynamics come and go, right? So we live in times where the social world is more or less reinforcing certain ways of being. So it's going to be harder, I think, to be more vulnerable together. But to me, that is what change demands. It demands.
So how do we co-create such spaces? How do you co-create such spaces to reach across that vast chasm, let's say, between conservatives and liberals, or people of different ethnic backgrounds, et cetera, different skin colors?
Yeah.
What do you do? How do you bring that love and action out
Yeah.
concretely, especially now?
Yeah. I think it's the same work I've been doing, but it is, and I do think it starts with my own, you know, I sometimes I think the word practices seems so, I don't know, it doesn't quite capture what I'm talking about. But like whatever I am able to do to keep myself grounded in a deeper sense of what it means to be alive is kind of the foundation of it. So sometimes that looks like a traditional meditation practice. Sometimes it looks like a less traditional, but I think of it as a meditation practice of like gazing out into the what we call the universe or the pluriverse, right? The sky, daylight, nighttime, whatever. I'm a stargazer, I guess. I get a certain kind of I have a certain practice of allowing the natural world to remind me that this man-made world and all of its contents is just the human create. It's like what we've come up with for now. It is not to be taken as the whole story.
Yeah. So noting that difference is helpful.
Every day, because to me, part of what we're up against is, again, as I've alluded, a juggernaut of efforts to make us forget.
Yeah.
And this is actually what I'm saying now is pointing to how I have what I feel inspires the compassion that underlies what I am seeking to manifest in the world. And by compassion, I mean that willingness to help alleviate the suffering that I think is pervasive in these times. That willingness to try to alleviate suffering, and not just for myself, but for as many human beings and more than human world, right? In as many ways as I can, comes from a sense that we live in this beautiful world that's like magical, like it's like unbelievably generous universe that's called for each of us in our own unique ways and supported us in living as well as we can. Water and like, I mean, it's just unbelievably generous and beautiful, this world. And at the same time, we are constantly being, reinforced with messages of like, we're not enough,
Mm-hmm.
need to, get this or that to be enough. And on, and, that person or this person's a threat. Like, these devices, I was looking for my phone, but I'm
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
these devices that we use are like, they're part of what's running these messages constantly. In other words,
Yes.
constantly, right, immersed in what could reinforce fear, separation,
Mm-hmm.
isolation, the sense that we're not enough, the sense that the natural world is just a plaything for our, whatever we want to do with it. So it's, I feel like waking ourselves out of the trance, the many trances of our time is really, really, really important to then be able to bring something fresh and real and loving and that willingness to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with waking ourselves up, and that's why I've been drawn so much to what we call mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really that inner call to wake up and to stay awakened to a broader sense of what it means to be alive.
Mm-hmm.
And if I sort of water my own, you know, sometimes parched heart and fearful mind and kind of do the part that I can to see things more clearly. From that place, I can open the door again and again and see not just what the conventional messages are telling me to see, a white man who's privileged, all these things. I can see another human being who is embedded and immersed in a world that's constantly trying to shape and
Yeah.
and that we're all struggling to see clearly, right? So, that energy to be of service and to do what I can, not to pile on and add
Mm-hmm.
misinformation and to add anxiety and to add stress. At this point, this seems to be, at least this is how I think of the ways we can prepare ourselves to meet each other in ways that can heal rather than reinforce separation.
Yeah.
What strikes me is that you're beautifully describing the kind of contagion that we need now.
Mm.
I mean, you talked about the
Yeah.
contagion of sort of authoritarian, patriarchal, divisive consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So, how I relate is, why not bring an equal force of awe-based consciousness, right?
I
What I
love.
was thinking,
Or,
yeah.
or to use the civil rights expression of eyes on the prize.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
The prize being, in my sense, or my feeling, the prize being, like you were describing before, the connection to the amazement, the gift of this opportunity that we all have to uh, discover ourselves and life. Uh, so how to model that, and I talk about an army. We need an army, the equivalent of the militant army of
Mm-hmm.
depth healers.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons for our credo here. But
Yeah. I think what you're saying so beautifully answers itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because how do we do it is how we're doing it, like how you're doing it with this effort. I don't think there's any just one way.
Mm-hmm.
I do think every way that we can encourage and amplify this energy that we're talking about matters and is, beneficial in ways obvious and not obvious, seen and not seen. Um, And, each of us, as I've mentioned many times here, has our own unique purview, position, like vantage point, place where we can do this. And so I love what you're doing. And I feel similarly kind of called right now to create spaces where we find each other, right? Those of us who are similarly aligned, and we amplify this energy, because I do think it's contagious, and I think the sociology, I happen to, my background before going to law was sociology. And so social psychology is something I turn to from time to time. But in terms of how to mend broken social and heal the divisions created by prejudice and segregation, because that's still what we're living with. Like we believe, 70 years ago, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation. And yet, like my law students will be like, what? Like segregation is everywhere. What? I don't even know what we're talking about, that it was somehow outlawed. The schools I went to, much resegregated, right? They're not as integrated in any way, shape, or form as much as they were when I went to school, the public schools in Virginia. So we've kind of in this way that now is deemed just de facto, just kind of how we want to live. Like we're just choosing this, leaving aside how many underlying systems, real estate, right? The economics of markets, and how race and racialization is sort of tied to how we value things. It's all still in there running, how we are. So we need places, and we need to actually disrupt some of these ways that we are being led to reinforce separation again and again, to continue these historic practices. We have to do things to disrupt them. And there's research that shows that when you bring people together under certain circumstances, right? This is the social psychological work that has for years helped us understand that there is value in coming together across difference, and engaging in work together. This is why sports teams work, even though they're diverse.
Mm-hmm.
This is why bands create beautiful music.
A common goal, despite our differences.
What's that?
A common goal, despite our differences.
A common goal where each of us has a unique and valued role.
Yeah.
And where the sort of wherever there is leadership or some overarching structure around that, there's at least enough support that we feel that we are, we're not alone in our efforts, and that we'll be reinforced and supported. Right. So there are these different aspects that we know can help us. And so creating such spaces, I think, is something I continue to be dedicated to doing, because in my own life, I've seen the value of it. I think there's no question we know how to do this. What I think is what we don't have is enough amplification, enough of what you're describing in the way of putting it out there. And not all dominant leaders want to see this. It's not that we haven't succeeded in breaking down barriers, it's that we have. And that there are certain people who can't then manipulate us politically, economically, or otherwise if we wake up. So I think that's what we're really up against.
That's huge.
Right? But once you see it, you're less. It's like, we're not going to fall for that again. we see whose bread is buttered, who's getting rich off of this unnecessary divisiveness, right? And who's getting rich anyways, in terms of power, in terms of economics, in terms of the intersection of those. And we don't have to fill those coffers. We can choose how to be. And so this is what I'm really excited about in terms of the work you all are doing, and the ways our work aligns.
Yeah. Wow.
I say reclaim disruption.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
own it. We own it.
Yeah. Right. And
I appreciate that.
wealthy we already are. Like,
Yes.
you know, and this is the true wealth. You know, I mean, this is, to me, it is like an invitation now that aligns with what the planet is calling for right now. So what we think of as kind of the merely social, the inner work of racial justice, or so you dealing with the patriarchy or whatever, it's actually, I think, very fundamentally about reorienting our relationship to all things, and, you know, minimizing this over reliance on like hyper accumulation, extraction of all the resources that travels with this idea of, you know, hierarchies of value, of human worth, and how you demonstrate it in the world. The entire planet is hoping that we will figure out that we were born wealthy. To be alive is to be born with like incredible ability to be contented with enough, not way too much, not so much more that I can no, but just like we actually have within us, within our communities, the ability to sort of be in right relationship with the resources that are here. So yeah, all of these things I think are the call that the future is sort of sending us. You know, that if we have the wisdom to hear it, can do healing on many, many, many levels.